everyone. I'm Amy, and welcome to Introspection. Today, my guest is Kelly Daugherty, who is a social worker and fellow in thanatology, which is the study of death, dying, and bereavement. She's dedicated more than 2 decades to the field of grief, driven by her own personal loss. Based in Malta, New York, which is between Albany and Saratoga Springs, she leads Greater Life Grief Counseling and the Center for Informed Grief, LLC, providing essential resources and training for those navigating grief and professionals in the field. Kelly also co-owns Healing Strides, LLC, where she merges emotional support with physical fitness in a very unique 7-week program that ends with a 5K race. She's a contributing author to Holistic Mental Health and Brave Kids, and is leading the upcoming collaborative book called The Grief Experience, which I am a participant in. Kelly also enjoys art projects, outdoor activities, and time with her husband, nieces, and nephews in her free time. Welcome to Introspection, the podcast about moving from grief to growth. I'm Amy Lindner-Lesser, your host. Introspection started out as a podcast about hospitality, innkeeping, and innkeepers. After about a year, I realized that my life and interests have morphed from hospitality to helping others navigate from grief and loss to growth and living. In this new version of Introspection, I will be talking about my personal experiences with loss, and there are quite a few, what I've learned along the way through my professional training, as well as from my coaching experiences. I'll also be bringing in guests to share interesting ideas. So grab a beverage, find a comfy place, take a deep breath, and listen in. Join me in welcoming Kelly.
Hello.
Hi.
I'm so excited to be here.
I'm very excited to have you. This has been a very interesting journey for me.
Yeah.
I moved to this area about 2.5 years ago, lost my best friend a year later, and decided that I wasn't going to let her life be just for nothing, and decided to take my social work background and my life coaching background and start in grief coaching. And I did something at that point, which was, I think it was about a little over a year ago, which is I reached out to Kelly and said, let's network, something that I rarely do. I'm definitely not the go-getter, get out there and meet strangers. And I'm so glad I did, because what ended up happening was Kelly told me about a book that she was the lead author in, and I agreed very excitedly to participate. So Kelly, tell us a little bit about what made you decide to put this book out into the world.
Well, I had always wanted to write a book on grief and loss, started it multiple times in my life, but I think fear always got in the way. It just always felt too big and too overwhelming. And like, okay, well, when I write it, what do I do next? And then I was approached by Laura Mazzata, who wrote Holistic Mental Health. She was the lead author for that. And she's like, I really want somebody with grief and loss. And she actually saw one of my advertisements for Healing Strides. And she was like, oh, I need this person in my book. And she reached out to another co-author, Sherry Davies, and was like, connect me with her. And so I was like, oh, a chapter? Absolutely. I could do that. That feels very manageable. I can get out there, start some writing, tell my story about my mom's death and how it's impacted me. And it'll be great, right? I was like, okay, one and done. And I've done what I wanted. You know, I want to be a published author. I want to have my name on the cover, and that's good. And then I was like, oh, Brave Kids, let me do that one now. And then I was like, well, I really want to be a lead author. And I spoke to Laura DeFranco, the publisher and CEO of Brave Healer Productions. And I was like, Laura, let's do this. And then I got scared. And I was like, no, I'm not doing this. This feels too big. And then like probably 4 months later, I reached out to her again, had another call with her. And I literally watched her email sit in my box for a long time. and I just didn't respond. And then she posted something, and I don't even know if she realizes this, but she posted something about, like people that aren't returning emails or something. And I was like, oh, I'm one of them.
You saw your name flashing in light.
Yes, I was like, oh. And so I spoke to Laura Mazzata from, Holistic Mental Health, and I was like, Laura, what should I do? She's like, do it. So by the time I got off the call with Laura, I was like, all right, I'm going to do it. And what I really wanted is, I love these collaborative books because everybody is able to tell their story, and everybody's story is so different. When you talk about your personal experiences, right? They're very different than mine, and vice versa. And are there similarities? Absolutely. But there's also so many differences. And I feel like so many of the grief books out there are very, they're one type of loss or they're one story. And so to be able to bring 25 authors together that are each sharing their own personal story, and then also giving a tool for the reader, it really is my goal. And I truly believe it's going to happen after reading everybody's stories, that whoever picks up that book is going to be able to relate to at least one of the authors in the book. And,
Definitely.
and feel hopefully less alone in their grief, have some tools to be able to help them on their grief journey, and feel supported and understood.
And that's the goal. And that's the wonderful
Exactly.
thing. Just like grief, the book, every chapter, even if there are two dealing with the same basic subject, every chapter is different because
Exactly.
everybody goes through their own grief.
Exactly.
So that's what's so wonderful. Now, you talk about tools.
Mhm.
Are all of the writers professionals, or are there some who are not professionally related to either mental health or bereavement?
I think we have a pretty good mix. There's a lot of therapists and a lot of social workers in the book. There's a couple that just have a passion for grief and wanting to share their stories. We have a couple of grief coaches. I really left it open because the reality is, just because somebody may not be doing this one-on-one on a daily basis like you and I do, doesn't mean they can't help somebody on their grief journey. And so it's a good mix of people. Even some of the therapists that are in there, their specialty may not be grief and loss, but they still have their own personal experience with grief, and it's something that they wanted to share. So it really is, it's not like all just grief coaches and grief therapists. It is a good mix.
And I think that's important for the
Mhm.
readers to understand that we all come from different backgrounds also.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's what I really wanted. I wanted that diversity of experiences, of backgrounds, of beliefs. There's, I think what's kind of funny. I mean, there's two chapters back to back. One is about the power of prayer. And then the next chapter is a medium that wrote her chapter. And I'm like, oh, talk about totally different experiences here, right?
Yeah.
And different beliefs. And so I love that. Like, I think that's what it should be, because the reality is everybody has different beliefs, right? The number one question you can ask somebody when they're grieving is, what do you believe happens when somebody dies, right? And everybody is going to have a different response.
And the response changes depending on more experiences that they have.
Absolutely. Yep.
I think if I had been asked that probably before my husband passed,
Mhm.
not so much when my dad and my grandfather and other, um, I would have had a very different answer. But I had a very strange experience 2 nights after my husband died,
Oh, yeah.
where I was in the bathroom at 2 o'clock in the morning and the light went off. And I looked around and I didn't
Mhm.
see a cat. And I'm like, okay, God only knows what possessed me. But I said, Steve, I love you. I miss you. Turn the damn light on. And it went
Yep.
on. My experience and what I believed changed at that
Mhm.
moment.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I was raised Catholic, grew up, went to Catholic school my whole life, and, always believed in heaven, right? And my husband, when I met him, he had some different beliefs and different backgrounds. And he gave me this book and he's like, oh, check this book out. And it was called Journey of Souls. And it's all about reincarnation. And he would find me at like 5 o'clock in the morning. He'd be like, what are you doing? I'm like, I'm just reading this book. It was like life changing for me and like blew my mind and made me think about everything so differently. So I'm the same. Like 10 years ago, if you would have asked me, I have very different belief now than I did.
And what I find is the more open I can be to these beliefs, the more synchronicities there are.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so,
Absolutely.
we have to
Absolutely.
be open to not knowing.
Exactly. And that's the reality. We don't know. And I think for some people, that's the hardest part, is that not knowing, right?
Yeah. And that book, somebody had me read about 2, 3 years ago. And I started to read it and I was like, I can't get through it. So I listened to on Audible.
Mm-hmm.
That works. So for somebody who doesn't want to read, it is a heavy book and it goes into a lot of depth with the writer, who's a psychologist, I believe,
Yep.
who
And
does past life
hypnotherapist. Yep.
regressions
Mm-hmm.
and brings people back and, interviews and learns. So if, definitely read it or listen to it. It's definitely worth it.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me.
So tell me a little bit more about the book. I know it's scheduled to be released on February 6th
Correct. Yeah.
on
So it'll go
Amazon.
on Amazon on February 6th. Yep. And it will be an ebook and paperback. Down the road, it will be also an Audible. And then, a few days later, hopefully we'll be able to get it into some local bookstores and things like that to make it more readily available. And some of the authors are already having pre-sales where they are selling the book ahead of time, an autographed copy. So that's really, depends on the author and their business.
And can you give us an idea of what types of grief are covered in the book?
Yeah, actually, I just made a list yesterday, and I was like, okay, I'm like gonna run out of room on this social media post, because there's like, it's everything. That's the reality, because I already wrote about my mom in holistic mental health. I chose not to do that as my chapter. I wrote about her in the introduction of the book a little bit, and my experience with grief as a high school student, but I decided to write about pet loss, because in the last year we had to say goodbye to both of our pups, and they were our babies. So pet loss is in there, and disenfranchised grief. And then we have our second chapter is about overdose loss. We have some suicide loss chapters. We have the death of a partner. We have death of friends. We have death of children. We also have infertility from a male's perspective and a female's perspective, and the grief that's associated with that, because we know that grief is not just about death, right? It is the feelings associated with the loss, and that loss could be anything, right? It could be that infertility piece of that, these expectations that this is what your family is supposed to be and what you're going to have, and then you struggle with that and you don't have that.
It's a loss of a dream.
Exactly. We have another girl, Tiffany, who's talking about going through a divorce and what that was like. And, she didn't even realize what she was experiencing. The physical symptoms she was experiencing was grief, until she actually went to a grief conference. And so it's a wide range of losses. And that's what I really wanted. That was my goal. I sat down on a Thanksgiving morning on a drive, and I wrote down all the different losses that I wanted in that book. And I think we did pretty good. Are there a few more that I would have liked to, but we only had 25 chapters, but I think it's a good representation and a wide range of different kinds of grief experiences.
And I love that there's a tool with each. Mm-hmm. And I was looking at the workbook that's coming out of that, and the tools are so different. There are meditations, there's journaling. What else?
There's mindfulness, there's dance, there's a lot of journaling. But what's interesting is all of the journaling tools are very different. They're different prompts used, they're different ways to use it. And so I thought that was interesting to see even that range. And because that's important, because just because we, think, oh, just journal. Well, what may work well for one person may not for another, but then another one of those tools may work better for that person.
Exactly. Or the questions that one person suggests
exactly
for journaling may be more applicable than for somebody else.
Absolutely.
And you and I talked a few seconds before we went on air about one of the authors who does a movement program, and that's for people who don't express their thoughts and their feelings in words as easily as they might be able to move.
Exactly. It's called she uses journey dance, and so I went to one of her workshops last year, totally out of my comfort zone. I'm just gonna put that out there. I am not
You
a
haven't gone
dancer,
yet.
and, unless it's some Irish step dancing or faking it, but, that's about it for me. But I went to her workshop, and it was really interesting to move through that experience and to see what actually came up, and it wasn't grief of my mom that came up, it was actually grief of my childhood home that I had really never paid attention to in my life and never realized how hard that was for me. I had just graduated high school. I was moving to Florida to start college. My dad sold the home, the only home I had known, the only home, I had lived in for 17 years and with my mom and all of those memories associated with that. And then saying goodbye to it at such a busy, exciting time in my life, but also really difficult. And so when I did that dance, all that grief came up, which I was like kind of blown away. I was like, oh, I did not expect that to happen. But it's really, I mean, she's really used movement as a big part of her healing journey, after the death of her child. And, in the book, she shares about where she was when she found out that her child died. And to be at a workshop doing that, I mean, what better place to be supported?
Right. But I'm glad that you also brought up your own feelings of loss at a time where, yes, moving from your home and was difficult, but it was also a time where most people would say, "Oh, you should have been happy. You were going to college." And I spend a lot of time talking to people about life transitions or stages that we go through that we expect to be happy times, yet they trigger feelings of grief, and we don't know to express them. We don't even know the
Exactly.
grief.
Mhm.
Moving from your home, even if your dad hadn't sold the home, would have been traumatic.
Yep, exactly.
You left
Exactly.
everything that you knew.
Mhm, mhm.
Or
I
for
went from
me,
Long Island to Florida where I didn't
right,
know one single person, you know?
or for me, I sold a business that I had for
Mhm,
25 years. It was where I lived, it was where I
mhm,
worked, it was the last place that my husband was present in my
mhm.
life.
Yep,
And then I moved from Massachusetts to New York State. It should have been a wonderful time in my life, and it was.
exactly. Mhm.
And it was also a time where there was tons of really difficult, heavy emotions going from one place where I had been and knew to an area that I knew nobody.
Yep, exactly. A big transition.
And our society, unfortunately, really does a very poor job of teaching us how to deal with all of those feelings and emotions.
Yeah. And just to the fact what you've just said and what I said, right, is the fact that you can have this joy and this grief, right? They can coexist. And I think that is the reality with all grief. I saw someone earlier today and she's experienced a new loss. And she said, right now I'm okay. She said, an hour ago, I was a hot mess. And she's like, and I'm like, what's going on? And I'm like, but that's what grief looks like. It is that oscillation and that back and that forth. And you can still have joy even though you have this heavy grief with you, and they can coexist. And I think that's okay for people to understand.
I think
Doesn't mean
it's
they're
even
losing their mind.
better than okay. It's
Ex-
wonderful for them to understand and to not
exactly.
throw guilt on themselves for the times that they are feeling happy.
Hmm. Hmm.
That,
Yep.
you know, the reality is we are alive. We need to celebrate whatever we can because
Exactly.
we get so many things that knock us down.
Well, it's like you talk about in your chapter, those silver linings, right? What you've talked about, why you're doing even this podcast, right, is you finding meaning in your grief.
Exactly.
Right? And for me as well, right? Why I do my job every day. I find meaning in my grief, right? Because of my mom's death. I've been able to help people for 22 years, right? With grief and loss. And it is about how do you find meaning in your grief? And sometimes in that early grief, it's hard to do, right?
Definitely.
Sometimes it takes a while, but it is those people that maybe, start a charity or become a social worker or whatever it is to find that meaning.
Definitely. So there's also something coming at the beginning of March that's
Yes.
that's
Yes.
part of this book and the book
Yep.
release. It's the grief
Exactly.
conference.
Exactly.
So
So I wanted to make sure that we had more of an opportunity to be able to connect with the authors. And so it kind of went back and forth. We've been playing around with this for several months, and I think we finally figured it out. So we're doing a virtual live conference. We do have a keynote speaker, Lisa Williams from the What's Your Grief platform, which is an amazing platform, and their book is amazing. So she's coming and going to kick off the conference for us. And then we're going to have 3 panel discussions on traumatic grief, children and grief, and then a panel that's going to focus on like anticipatory grief, ambiguous loss, disenfranchised grief. And then we'll have a chance for questions at the end. And then what's really awesome is that everybody that registers for it is also going to receive a bunch of bonus stuff. And that's going to cover a ton of individual recordings from the authors where they share more about their personal stories, where they share some tools and resources. And I think we're going to have like probably about 12 of those videos that are all going to be bonus. So people can watch them on their own. We will also
and make sure
include
to watch them because I have one of those.
Yes, you do. And then we are also going to have the workbook that you mentioned a little while ago, which has actually all the tools from the book, the majority of them. There's a couple that weren't really needed to be in the book, but the majority of the tools, so people can write them out. So for yours that you had some prompts, they're going to be able to just print this workbook out and write into it so that way they don't feel like they have to do it in the actual book. And then all the recordings from the panels and the keynote speaker will also be recorded and be sent to all the participants so you can watch it again. So if you can't attend live, you can still get all the great stuff and watch it on your own. So I'm really excited to be able to offer that and really hope that it's going to be some really valuable information for people who are grieving.
I think it's a great option, especially since, there are things for professionals or people in the mental health field, but there's very little that's directed to the general public.
Exactly.
And that's what I think is so wonderful about the book as well as the conference.
Yeah. And I think personally, every therapist should read it as well and take part, because you know what? Therapists aren't grief informed. The majority of them aren't. And a lot of them are extremely uncomfortable with working with grief clients. And whether it's because of their own personal experience or they haven't maybe had an experience with grief, and so they don't understand it. And so, I think as much as, yes, this book and this conference are for people who are grieving, it absolutely should be something that mental health professionals and coaches should be taking part in and reading as well, because
Required reading.
it's important. Yes, please, because 60% of therapists have not had any training in grief and loss in their undergraduate or graduate programs.
Wow, that's amazing.
And there's a lot of therapists out there that are sharing really outdated information with their grief clients and makes them think that they're doing their grief wrong. And then they come to someone like you or I because they were with their last therapist and it wasn't a good fit.
Yes, that's true. You mentioned 2 terms, which I know, but I don't know that our audience necessarily knows. You talked about disenfranchised grief, and what else?
Ambiguous.
I'm sorry, say that again.
Was it ambiguous?
Ambiguous, yes.
So disenfranchised loss is loss that isn't always accepted by society, right? It's something that doesn't really get the support, like it's minimized, right? So pet loss is one of those, right? Oh, it's just a dog. You can get another dog, right? Even I think miscarriages are disenfranchised. That is not talked about enough at all. And so many women experience it, right? And we don't want to tell when somebody's pregnant too soon, because what if something happens? Well, then they get no support because they haven't told. Right. And so even like I've worked with some people where their ex-spouse has died and they're grieving for that person, but that's not accepted either, right? Because you were divorced from them. You're supposed to be over that, right?
Or even an old boyfriend. I remember reading on Facebook that my high school boyfriend had died. Now, I was already a widow, so I had gone
Mhm.
through my own
Yep.
husband's death,
Mhm.
but yet somehow that just hit me. We hadn't been in contact for like 40 years. It
Yeah,
didn't matter.
exactly. But
He was part of my childhood and was an
Mhm.
important part of my teenage years. And
Exactly.
there was grief. Yeah.
Yep. Yep. So,
And
yeah,
and
so
even
that
a job,
disenfranchised excuse me?
even losing a job
Mhm.
where people are like, "Oh, you'll
Mhm.
get another job." It's
No,
nothing
especially
is ever going to replace it. It's not going to be the same.
exactly. Say you've worked there for 20 years and then you're laid off. Or God forbid you're fired, right? And what that and then how you feel about that.
Yeah.
So that and then ambiguous loss really comes down to presence. So ambiguous loss has like kind of two parts, right? So where there is maybe somebody with Alzheimer's, right? So they are physically still here, but psychologically they may be gone, right? And then we have the other part of ambiguous, which is more of they're physically gone, but maybe psychologically still here. So maybe somebody that's been kidnapped or somebody that's missing, right? So it really comes down to presence, and how do you grieve for that, right? That ambiguous also can kind of, I think sometimes with the like Alzheimer's and dementia, right? That also is anticipatory grief as well. That pre-grieving that we do before somebody dies. But as one of our co-authors talks about, she talks about her experience with her husband who has younger onset Alzheimer's. And she talks about getting that diagnosis and what that was like. And so she's grieving these changes in him every single day that she sees, right? That lack of presence, not being able to talk to him about certain things because he's not retaining it anymore.
And it's dying multiple deaths or grieving
Mhm.
multiple deaths, really.
Exactly. Yep.
And
And
I
we
know I
even
went through that with my husband. He had stage 4 metastatic melanoma.
Mhm.
And as soon as it came back, I started to grieve,
Yep.
thinking, "Oh, it'll be fine." And then, like a month after he actually died, I was hit over the head
Yep. I'm sure.
because I thought I had done everything to grieve.
Mhm. Mhm.
And, we
Well,
try to
that's
protect ourselves,
yeah.
but we
Well,
don't.
people think, "Oh, well, I had all this anticipatory grief." And sometimes, especially when somebody is ill and you've been their caretaker, right? Sometimes there is that sense of relief when they die. And then they feel guilty for having that sense of relief. But being a caretaker is exhausting
Yeah,
and it's a lot of work. And so of course there's some relief because you're not having to deal with that. But then again, like you said, that month later or that 6 weeks later when
whenever
the
it is.
flowers have died, the cards have stopped, and then it hits you that this is your reality.
Yeah,
And you could have done all the grief work, a ton of grief work prior. It still doesn't mean that you're not going to grieve after the loss.
exactly. I want to make sure that we touch on Healing Strides too, because I think it's such an unusual program and
Mm.
it's such a great gift to again put motion and movement with feelings.
Absolutely.
So how
So
did the idea come to you? And you know,
Well, so I think it was probably in 2010. I met Lisa, who's one of the co-authors as well. Met Lisa at a grief camp. And we became friends. And then my sister's like, let's do this 5K training program. And I was like, me? No. Like, I don't run. Like, I hid in high school on the mile run and got in trouble because I hid in the bushes. Like, I was not a runner. So I signed up for this 5K training program with my sister and I showed up and it was Lisa was the coach. And I was like, oh, how awesome. And then I became really involved in that. And then I became a mentor in that program. And then her and I, because she also has a mental health background, she and I decided to start a teen group. And we combined mindfulness and self esteem with running at a local nonprofit that I worked at. And so we did that for a few years. Amazing program. Love it. Still goes on there. And then when I made the shift to private practice, I really just wanted to get back to my roots of why I became a social worker and really only focus on grief and loss. And so I said to Lisa, why don't we target women that are grieving? And so Healing Strides came out of that. So the first hour is a traditional grief group. And then the second hour, we train for the 5K race. And at the end of the 7 weeks, we all run a 5K together. Our spring session starts in April. And so every spring session, we run the Freihofer's Run for Women in Albany, New York, which is the most amazing race ever because it's all women. And it's like thousands of women. It's so empowering and moving and amazing. But to see these women who are grieving that sometimes just have a hard time getting out of bed in the morning and can't even think the future and set goals for themselves, to see them show up every week, push themselves, and then to see them cross that finish line is the most unbelievable feeling you can ever imagine. And what they say when they're done and the feedback we've received, it's been so positive that we actually now have a research project through Empire State University where we are doing pre and post tests and follow-ups to determine the effectiveness. And our goal is to get it published and to be able to get Healing Strides out into the world because it is life-changing for these women. Now we've had volunteer mentors this whole time where we have that they're there. So nobody's alone on the course, right? You have somebody there supporting you, encouraging you. But now our mentors are past participants that have done a few rounds of Healing Strides. They want to give back, and to see that and to see the growth that they've made through this, it's my baby, and I love it, and it's my favorite thing to do. I wish Healing Strides could happen all the time, but we do 2 seasons a year, and it's a lot of work. So.
And it's a little tough doing any kind of running in the winter here.
Yes, that's what I'm thinking. I'm like, oh, I got to start running again because it's coming up soon.
I'm just thinking about the wonderful relationships and support that must come out of that from peer support. Absolutely. Knowing that the woman running next to you or sitting next to you has been through something similar. Obviously, it could be a completely different loss. Mm-hmm. But that you're both healing through that must be just fascinating.
And at the race, we have these little bibs that they wear on the back, and it says, "And with every step I take, I run in memory of," and they write their loved one's name. Oh. And one woman brought a picture of her children that had died, and she ran with that on her back. Oh. And I remember the last year at the Freihofer, somebody came up to me, and I always put my mom on mine, and this woman came up. We were just starting the race and got up the first hill or whatever, and some woman came up next to me, and she said, "Your mom would be so proud of you." Sorry. And I just burst into tears right there on the racetrack.
Now.
And I was like, this is what it's about. And yeah, so sorry.
And my guess is that she was behind you as you were climbing that hill, pushing.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So,
and I think the fact that we're both crying is a wonderful reminder to others that every day when we've lost somebody that we love, when we're grieving, the grief doesn't go away. It always is there with you by your side. And absolutely. Sometimes it's more active. It's in some ways like a child. I think of my toddlers when my kids were little, that sometimes they'd walk really nicely by my side. Other times they'd be pushing and poking yes. and running. Sometimes they'd be jumping. And then other times I'd be pushing them in the stroller and they'd be asleep. So they were always there. And you never quite knew what was going to trigger the reaction. And I think that's very much like grief.
Yeah. I mean, it will be 30 years ago that my mom died, and it can still come up just like that when I don't expect it. And, and that's okay. I'm okay with that. I've learned, we talk about resilience, right, with grief, and that it's that healthy adaptation to loss. How can we adapt this into our life? We're still carrying it with us, though. Yes. It's never gone. It's not something we ever get over completely. It's just sometimes we've grown bigger than our grief and through our grief. But sometimes it can just hit, and that's okay.
And it is true that grief sort of is because we loved that person or that thing, whatever it was, even if it was a job, we cared about it, we loved it, we had a deep relationship with it. And it's reminding us of that. So that's not a bad thing at all.
Nope.
Tears are good.
Yeah.
In our eyes.
Well, I don't think I've ever gotten through a race day of healing strides without crying. So usually multiple times. So, and on the way home. And that's usually like joy, right? That's tears of joy, because it is so, to see a 71-year-old lady cross that finish line and to see her granddaughter with a sign holding up, and for her to give you a hug and say, this was on my bucket list and I would have never done this without you. And he was with me the whole time, and whatever. And just, it's those things that that's what makes that group so amazing and unique, and just, and we have some of the best mentors. Some of these volunteer mentors started with Lisa and I back in 2013 when we started with the teens. And then we made this shift to grief, and they're like, okay, we can do this. We don't really, and
your teens are now adults who could be mentors.
Yep, exactly.
No, that's great. And do you ever have people who can't run, who might be able to walk, so they could do the race walking?
Absolutely. Yep. And so Lisa it's pretty much, we follow a couch to 5K program. So for someone who says that they've never run, it's definitely possible if that's what they choose to do. But we have plenty of walkers. We have walk runners, which is what usually I am. And then we have the people that I can't keep up with that Lisa has to be with me.
Walk runners, like walk a little, run a little.
So so we run for a minute and then walk for 2 and keep that up. And you know what? We can still complete that 5K in, under 40 minutes. So,
and that's what's important, is that you set that goal and you make it, no matter how you make it, whether you're walking, you're crawling, you're using a walker.
Our normal race for fall got changed this past year. So we wound up doing one in our local community, which was a trail run. Well, great. Okay. Well, then Lisa went and did the course one day and was like, oh my gosh, this is really hard. And then I went with her and I was like, this is really hard. And we asked the women, we can postpone and do it. They're like, no, we're going to do it. And so it was more hiking really than anything. But we had our hiking poles out on the day of the race, and it still was absolutely amazing. And it may have not been what we envisioned before we started the group for that season. It still wound up being just as powerful and just as beneficial for these women. And it was a beautiful course. We were in the woods the whole time, and it was very cold, but but we did it. And that's what it was all about. They were determined to do it, and nobody backed out, and even when they saw we would meet every week at the course and practice a little bit more. And I was like, oh, they're not gonna like this hill. And they did it.
That's great.
So, yeah.
I'm hearing a common theme through what we've talked about, which is, okay, I have to just come up with a way of saying it without saying a quote bad word. JFDI, just freaking do it.
Exactly.
Forget the fear. Forget what your preconceived notions are going to be. Just take that first step, and do it. And I would say 9.9 times out of 10, you're going to be happy you did. That,
exactly.
When we allow our fear to get in the way, we're predicting things happening that we have no idea if they're really going to happen. And we just, I always tell myself, you're scared? Okay, do it.
Exactly.
Do it anyway.
Do it anyway. Yep.
Am I missing anything that you want to share with our viewers about you, about the book, about the conference, about Healing Strides?
So, just a couple of things. We are having a Facebook launch party on February 9th at 10 a.m. It is through Brave Healer Productions through their Facebook page. But if you go to the Grief Experience on Facebook or Instagram, you can see details for that as well. And that's going to be fun because all the authors will come. We're going to share a little bit more about us, get to celebrate our success, that hopefully at that point we're an Amazon bestseller. And we're also going to be giving away some tickets to the conference on that. So you have to be present for that. So we would love to have you join us for that. And if you are in the capital region of New York on Thursday, February 29th at Palette in Saratoga Springs, we are going to have a book launch party with several of the local authors because 11 out of the 25 authors in the book are from the Saratoga region. So this will be a great opportunity to come and meet the authors, maybe get your book signed. That will be from 5 to 7 p.m.
And I will be there.
And me too. And we even have some out-of-town authors coming, so that's exciting.
Yeah. And then there's another thing. I agreed to read my chapter.
Oh, you're doing that, huh?
I am.
Good
and
for you.
That's another JFDI if you're scared. As a New Yorker, I've never liked my voice. And so doing anything like this is a big thing. But
I'll tell you, Amy, I was like, oh, I can't do that.
I'm going to try. The worst thing that'll happen is it'll be so bad that they won't use it. But I'm going to try and record it, and that will be available through Brave Healer Productions too.
That's awesome. Good for you.
So I'm hoping others will also do that.
Yeah, I think Sherry said she was going to do that. And I was like, oh, I can't do that. So maybe I need to take your advice and just do it. But
why not? I think, it'll have your voice and your inflection too.
Exactly.
Which only we can give. When somebody else is reading it, they don't know the spots that make you laugh.
Yep. Yep.
Well, thank you so much. We're going to make sure to have how to contact you up in the notes. And we can also add the launch information.
Perfect.
To the note.
And the conference. Yep.
Yes.
That'd be great. Okay.
Okay.
Well, thank you, Amy. I want to thank you for having me on. I want to thank you for being a part of this project. And, it's been really a joy to get to know you over this last year while doing this. And thank you for what you do for grieving women. And I'm just so grateful that we've connected.
I am too. Thank you so much, Kelly.
All right. Thank you.
If you liked what you heard on this podcast and want to hear more, please follow us and tell your friends. You can also find me on Facebook at Amy Lindner Lesser, Grief to Growth Life Coaching, and on LinkedIn at Amy Lindner Lesser. Thanks again.